when I was received the call to help put this together, I immediately thought about conversations we've all had over the years about graffiti, street art, but one thing that really came to mind was totally by accident, I sat next to Arthur Jaffa at a dinner, and he asked me, "What are you working on?" And I'd never met him. He's a big deal. And I said, I'm doing a show about graffiti, the evolution of graffiti, street art in Lisbon. And his response was, "That's really important. I'm so glad to hear you're doing that." And I was kind of shocked that he would say that. And I said, well, and he probably saw the look of shock on my face. And he said, because it is one of the most influential movements of the 20th century. And he probably saw the look of shock in my face again and said, "And if someone doesn't believe you, have them look out the window when they're in a train." And that really made me think, and it was something I couldn't get out of my head. And it wasn't until after the show, and Callie, thank you for coming to Lisbon, that I was actually in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and they were doing a muralist street art show. And Martha Cooper was there, and Futura was there, and they had also been in the show in Lisbon. That when I saw a mural work from artists in Tehran, Khartoum, Baghdad, capitals of countries that it would be tough for most people to guess what country they're in, right? I realized the impact of this movement, and I'll go ahead and start the slides here. Because, and you'll see images of Martha Cooper's work, and because it's really where these images came from, right? Where this work came from that really astounds me, which is it comes from, sorry guys. So it comes from parts of New York that were destroyed. The Lower East Side and the Bronx in the late 60s, early 70s were devastated. And this work emerges, this creativity really emerges from the street. And I think that that's really important because it really talks about, the power of creativity and just the crazy stuff kids will do when they're bored. So I wanted to kind of run that through for a bit, and so you could see that. And then I'll stop them for a second. And then but before we get too far, I think it's important to point out some of the terminologies, right? Because Callie, you and I have known each other for a long time, and the first time I was chasing you to do a show, the term street art didn't exist. Yeah, it wasn't. Wait.
Yeah, we didn't even have a name for it. It was just this thing we were doing.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's always, so many people, many artists are kind of disillusioned with the title, right? Not to be surprised, minimalism wasn't very popular with Donald Judd, and impressionists weren't happy with their title either. But how do you, what can you tell us about, this genre, what it was like then when you were doing something that didn't have a name, and how graffiti inspired that,
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that in a while, how almost kind of primal it is to be doing something that you don't feel like you need to label in a way. And, I was a kid from Florida before the internet. So my idea of art was the classics in a frame on canvas on the wall. And that was my study. I studied really classically. And then I got to New York, and Revs is writing his entire diary in the subway. People are hanging off of roofs, doing these things. And also, I had grown up also on Rauschenberg and on these kind of wild collages. And when I got to New York, I was oh, it's just the street. He that's what he was looking at, And so I was it just blew open my concept of what art could be.
Thank you. And RJ, you're like the scholar here. No, you are. You've always you have tremendous knowledge, and I also really admire you because in probably the the genre or group of artists that are most supportive of each other and least critical. You were a critical voice, which I know wasn't easy. And you've
Got a lot of death threats.
but I think it's important because in some ways you played this very important role of the conscious and question things and which I think is important. But can you help us clarify like graffiti, street art? I know it's sort of like defining modernism, but what's your take on this?
I mean, I think if you ask the graffiti writers, first of all, there's that term writer, right? They're going to say, I'm a writer and I'm writing my name, and eventually that shifted into folks maybe had a logo, but at its core, it's really that simple, right? It's people who write their name a lot of times, and I sometimes, I will proudly describe it as a pissing contest, and it's a pissing contest that I enjoy observing, right? And I think it's okay that we describe it as a game, right? The last thing I'll say on graffiti is, and it can be also aesthetically beautiful, but it's a performance, right? If you see an ugly tag on the side of a building, you have to also think about, well, okay, I might not like that aesthetically. I might not like that building was vandalized, but what a physical feat that somebody leaned off the side of this building, maybe tied themselves with a rope and rappelled down and did this at 3 a.m. and no one noticed, and they were able to get away with this thing in maybe it was 5 minutes, maybe it was 5 hours, right? And that performance, really what you're looking at with a piece of graffiti is the remnant of a performance. On the other hand, I think when you see Callie's work, when you were doing work on the street, I don't think I would describe that as a remnant of a performance. I'd say that's some art that you happen to have installed in an atypical setting.
Yeah, and I also feel like, whereas graffiti was a very insular genre, with few exceptions like Lee Quinones, most were really writing for each other. It was a very competitive sport where they were trying to outdo each other with size, the trains, stylistically. Whereas street art is much more supportive.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think Blade is an early writer who's a good example of this. If you look at Blade's work over the years, and he'll talk about this, and again, not to dismiss the aesthetic aspect because he's a great painter, he'll say, yeah, I was doing a piece that used 3 colors, and then somebody else used 3 colors, so I had to use 4 colors, and then 5 colors, and I had to do a composition and so all of that aesthetic element of it was really in competition with the other writers, not necessarily so that the average, I don't want to totally discount like the average person seeing it, right? But it was insular, yeah. And Callie, again, going back to what you said, you couldn't have been insular because who else would you have been talking to? There were like 10 of you all at Pratt and you'd only have been talking to you guys.
Well, also, when I asked Callie once about this, about a message in your work, you're like, well, duh, that's why I do it in public space. There was something like that, right? I mean, can you talk a bit about that?
I think that for me, so much of the impulse was about, there was that kind of first impulse of like the wildness of the streets, but it was also this feeling of like just wanting to communicate with people. Cause like I was a kid from the end of the dirt road in Florida. Like when I first started to even come to museums, I was like, am I allowed to be in here? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's very instinctive, this feeling of like, I'm not of this place. And so I was just like, had this feeling of needing to make work for that anyone could discover at any time. And I sort of felt like that alone was that first sort of like gesture toward that like communication. You're sort of reaching out toward people, and then over the years, like what is contained within that as far as a message kind of changed. But I feel like, the medium kind of is the message in that instance.
No, thank you. It's also, the idea of, whereas sometimes, even though they call themselves writers, you really can't, it's very difficult to decipher. Whereas street art is intentionally relatable, right? It's relatable in form, it's relatable in where it's located. So there was kind of that interesting difference between graffiti and street art, whereas graffiti is kind of an insular practice taking place in public space, whereas street art is, a much more relatable, intentionally relatable. Alfonso, I haven't forgotten about you. And you actually play a very special role here, so thank you for coming, because whereas Cali grew up before the name of street art existed, right? And I remember that even I couldn't tell the difference between street art and graffiti. And I had a very awkward conversation with a graffiti writer in LA who was showing me his book. When I mentioned Shepard Fairey, he said, Shepard Fairey's not a graffiti artist. He doesn't do graffiti. And I was like, oh wow, I feel really uncool and like a total loser. But and I was like, oh, but it like, that little crack of light that makes you kind of opens up the world. And being a much younger artist, growing up in LA, seeing graffiti, seeing street art, for you, these genres there was no question that it was art, I'm guessing. Right? For you, these were things you were looking at. And can you tell us what graffiti and street art mean to you and your practice?
Well, LA is a very specific place, so the graffiti there is sort of like influenced by the gangs. And there's different crews that lean more towards like the gang culture. But yeah, sort of like we were saying, it's like street art is art that's made in the street. Graffiti is a very specific subculture culture that is insular, so it's meant for your peers.
And I've seen how the urban landscape, and we'll have slides of your work we'll look at in a bit, but how have you incorporated it into your practice?
Yeah, I mean, when I first started going to museums, I even just like looking at abstract expressionists and like say like a Rothko, I would see that and I would see a buff mark on the side of a wall. That was sort of like through my life experience and perspective, that's what I could relate it to. Or like a Cy Twombly like gesture scribble that's like a tag. But when I read about it or when I learned more about it, I realized it was like completely different. But it's also, graffiti is also expressive, so it's like kids having fun. It's when you see layers of even beef of like people who have tension crossing each other out, it becomes like this big jumbled mess abstraction. And those are the moments that I'm sort of like capturing in some of the work that I do. So well, I'm thinking, now that I have the perspective of art history along with my background in graffiti, I could approach it from these different angles and sort of mix these worlds.
Thank you. You were going to say something?
I was just going to say that jumbled mess is like a great point, right? It's telling a story of interpersonal relations, but also over time, right? Again, this is multiple performances, if you will, these tags or these pieces over each other. And yeah, it's a very, it's a cool thing to, whether it's in your paintings or it's literally on the street, to try and piece together, okay, I saw this person in these three neighborhoods. Oh, but in this neighborhood, they always get crossed out by such and such. Like, what is going on there, right? It's it's pretty unique to street art and graffiti that you can find those stories, at least that publicly. I know other artists don't like each other necessarily, but it doesn't play out quite the same.
Thank you for that, RJ. I'm going to switch now to a guy who plays a very important role in OSGEMEOS' career, and so Barry McGee. So Barry sent this to me yesterday. It's an invitation to a anti-fascist run club, right, in Paris. He has an opening on Saturday, and he wanted me to come. I was in San Francisco. He said, I'm not there, but come to Paris for my fun run. And then he showed me this as well, Femmes Against Fascism, right? Also part of his the events he's holding. And mind you, he's there to do a show at a gallery, and he keeps sending me these things about the stuff he's doing. So Barry, I've worked with him several times, and it is always chaotic. I mean, chaos ensues with Barry. He is, in a way, the spirit of chaos. And This last time I worked with him in Portugal, I had finally learned that it's sort of like, he's a surfer, like riding a wave, right? You just sort of have to let him do what he's going to do and not expect anything, because whatever you expect, whatever you tell the museum, oh, this is what he's going to do, he'll do something else. And then they're like, Pedro, but you said, and no, he does whatever he wants. But Barry played a very important role in OSGEMEOS' career. The guys, they were at one point working in a bank. They didn't grow up in a household where art was really a possibility. They didn't really see themselves as artists. But Barry saw their work. He was on fellowship in Sao Paulo, saw their work and found them and began to work with them. And he was a driving force, an inspiration behind their work. And I think he's someone who's been an influence on everyone. And I'd love to hear, and I also need to point out that I've been to see Alfonso several times, and the only time he didn't answer the door, and I'm standing in his outside his studio in East LA, and I'm wondering, where is he? It was because Barry was in there, and you and Mario Ayala were having a blast. So would you all share a little bit about how Barry has influenced your work and your worldview?
Yeah. Wait, can I tell about the soup first, though?
Oh, we'll get to OSGEMEOS
Okay,
next.
not yet. Okay. So Barry, I mean, it's, thinking about sort of immersive installation, I feel like there is a line, and I don't really properly know the history of this, but I know that people were sort of, obviously like large scale installation works like Walter de Maria's Earth Room and things were happening. But honestly, for me, it was Street Market. It was like Street Market, which is Barry and Steve did this huge thing at Deitch on Wooster. And it was, for me, it was just like one of those shows that kind of, again, like blew open your concept of what art could be. And then he was also that, kid that was crossing over, and him, Margaret was riding on freight trains, and they just like, there were so many ways that they were like kind of heroes to even, people like me who were so early in that, and we still like, they were full out. And Barry almost cracked my head open in a swimming pool once. But didn't. But the look on his face as I was flying backwards, I was like, oh my God, what's happening? And then I landed and it was fine. So
Oh gosh.
almost chaos, but not totally.
I'll briefly say that I think the posters you're showing are a good example of this. The thing that really sticks in my mind whenever I think about Barry and that I try to bring into my practice is his love of community. And you see it with OSGEMEOS too. If you've seen this exhibition, you see the collaboration with Barry McGee, collaboration with JR, Martha Cooper, and even in the sort of ephemera section here in this show, that's all influenced by Barry. That's all. If you go to a Barry show, it might be 50% other people's work, and it's credited, and it's. I mean, when he had his show at the Boston ICA, it was about bringing in all these Boston graffiti writers who would never have otherwise gotten a chance to show at the Boston ICA, and talking with some of those writers that night, it was a highlight of their careers to have a little zine in there. So I think the way that Barry brings everyone in his world into the gallery, into the museum, and brings them in is really special.
Thank you.
Yeah, Barry was an artist that I would see in skate magazines and graffiti magazines. So skateboard magazines would sometimes include art, and it was a lot of his work. And I also seen his work a bit on the streets. So he has like some of the best graffiti, the best tags, like straight letters, but also, like the characters and the gallery work. But the fact that it was so accessible to me as a child through these magazines, I didn't really know, other artists weren't featured in these things that a kid could see. So I think back at the Street Market show at Deitch. A lot of shows at Deitch, were also in these magazines. So that's like some of my earliest memories, and I feel like a lot of the work that he did throughout the years is like really inspires me and a lot of my peers, and I feel like he inspired an entire generation and continues to do so. You know, he does these different shows. He did one in LA recently, and some of my younger friends, like teens, were featured in the show. You know, it was like their first time even being in a gallery. And so it's great to see that energy still going, and these young people feeling like they have a chance, you know, an opportunity to show their work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to point out this image, the first street art show I did. I invited Barry and OSGEMEOS, and it was in Newcastle, England. They all came, and they hadn't seen each other in a long time, and they hadn't painted together in a long time. And the very first day, the head of graffiti control for the city public transportation system came in and wanted to talk to me. And I was like, God, my first day, I was terrified. And the guy looked at me and said, "Hey, Pedro, I'm so glad, I'm so excited for your show. This is awesome." And again, I must have a very expressive face, because he was like, "Yeah, you're confused. Look, I've been cleaning up junk for years. And I've learned to love this stuff. And you're bringing the gods, so I'm thrilled. And you're going to save me money." And I was like, "What?" And then he said, "Because I'm going to give you my walls, and I'm going to let your artists come and paint. And those walls are here. This is what you're looking at." And he said, "And no one's going to go over them, because they love and respect these artists." So this was a real learning experience for me. And I think, you know, for me, working with Barry has been always difficult. This nightmare was right in front of the mayor's office in San Diego, and you know, almost, you know, and as you can see, it's almost all tags, right? And I promised, the museum director called me and he said, "Pedro, no more tags." And I said, "Okay, I promise, no more tags. I will tell Barry no more tags." But I said, "But I think it's a bad idea, actually." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, because Barry's he's like jujitsu. Anything we say, he will use against us." He's like, "Are you crazy? He's a professional artist. This is a museum, and this is an exhibition, and you know, you need to tell him." So I did, and then I called Barry and I told him. He said, "Pedro, don't worry, I promise, no more tags. But can we have the keys to the lift and the paint?" Because the museum had hidden. I said, "Yeah, I'll give it to you, but please, no more tags." "Pedro, I promise, no more tags." So this later became, right, so the first time he did a tag mural was in San Diego for me. I'm very proud of it, which was later done in the what do you call it?
Houston Bowery.
Houston and Bowery, and yeah. So, but now let's talk a bit about the twins, because you know, these guys, and I'm just going to let the images run now, and they'll be on loop, so you'll be able to see lots of stuff. But you know, I think for me, what's interesting about the twins is that, yeah, you mentioned the pre-internet era, right? So there was a time, it's hard to remember now, but there was a time when, particularly if you lived outside of the United States or Western Europe, if you showed up with a skate magazine or a new album in Mexico City or Sao Paulo, you were like, God, that was serious currency, because this was stuff you couldn't get, right? So for the artists, right, for OSGEMEOS, Wild Style, the magazines, all of these things were currency, but it was also very, very far away. So a lot of their work is this idealization of graffiti, right? And we see that in a lot of the work in the show. Well, here, let's go back. For instance, these pieces here, right? You're looking at this idealization of painting, of graffiti. And as Marina well knows, they don't like to be called graffiti artists. The graffiti to them is something very sacred, right? And it's something that that's graffiti. We make art. And I think that there's a lot more to their art than graffiti, quite honestly, there is. And so I just wanted to point that out, because I think it's a great way to contextualize their work, because I often feel like when I see graffiti in other parts of the world, a lot of it is derivative of New York Wild Style, right? But it's different in Brazil. And I think that was the benefit of the distance. right? They tell me about like Brazilian spray paint in the 80s was like, nothing. Like it didn't work. So they had to come up with their own, rollers and their own way of doing things. And also, and it made them more creative and resourceful. And they learned how to paint to make it look like spray paint, even though it wasn't. So, I was going to ask Alfonso, how you when I invited you to do this, you were like, yeah, man, totally, I love OSGEMEOS. So tell us, what is it you love about these guys?
Well, I mean, they're at the top of like artists who come from a graffiti background, like that, like just even seeing this exhibition, this is serious, so same as like, similar to Barry, it's like I feel like when I would see their work and how respected it is, it made me feel like there was an opportunity for me to also participate in the art world that really feels, like sort of like you said, when you first entered a museum, it was kind of like, whoa, like, am I supposed to be here? But when I see artists like this, I feel like it's possible. And yeah, like early on, there were artists that did that. But also, just to see them keep it real, so I would see their work on the street or see photos, and it's like they're really participating in the culture. And yeah, as I'm here and I'm looking around, I just got here a few hours ago, but I was even looking at the records behind us. I'm like, do these guys ever chill? Like, are they have to always be drawing? I mean, like, if you're not making a massive installation or painting or, detailed thing, you're like, I could imagine them, not being able to watch a movie and painting on the record, or whatever, making stickers or what, just always doing that. So I feel like when artists sometimes, we've all seen people reach a level of success and sort of, I don't know, lose that ambition. But I feel like just seeing their work, I feel like, they really are passionate about it, and it shows.
Caledonia.
All right, I just remembered.
You remember?
I just
Tell us.
remembered the first time I met them, which was so cute. So it was like 2003 or 4. We were doing a show in Manchester, and I was pretty excited because, they're so disarming and lovely, like their work, So they were already kind of, just favorites, but we got to like the dinner, the little artist dinner, and at this time they really didn't speak almost any English. And we were just at this noodle shop, but they were also like, it's you. And I was like, it's you. And we were so excited, but we kind of couldn't really quite talk. And so we just ended up like taking the vegetables like out of our soup somehow. And then like Otavio starts like building a boat, and then Gustavo like puts like a little carrot and like a person. And then we're like building like little toys out of our soup vegetables and like steering them around and making a story. And I was like, I love you forever. And I feel like that is the thing, like when you see this work and when you feel that sense of wonder, it's real, like it's utterly real. And so that for me is the other kind of wellspring that just runs through it. And it's also so inventive. You'll see, in the kind of the genre of like artists that have come off the street, one of the pitfalls I think of this generation is that sometimes you'll see like rubber stamp people who just like bum, 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 and they just do the same thing over and over again. And while these guys have consistent character and styles, the like level of inventiveness and play is just nonstop, and I just live for it.
So I was about to ask you what you admire about them, because we all have different skills, and it sounds like you answered my question. RJ, what about you? How do these guys resonate with you? What impacts you?
I mean, I think the first time I saw their work in person would have been when they painted the outside of the Tate Modern, and along with Blue and Fail and some really wonderful artists. But what a bold painting, a giant naked man on the side of this iconic museum. But I think really what resonates with me, though, is everything you're saying about that love of going back to Martha Cooper's photographs, and I mean, having Martha's work here in this show, and the way that they have a devotion to this 1980s world and then putting their spin on it is really, to me that's what it's about, and it's an inspiring devotion to be like, this thing mattered, right? It mattered so much that they devoted their lives to it. So like, probably I should read Subway Art, I should probably keep that book on the shelf.
Thank you all for that. I think it's also important to point out that there was a moment where museums absolutely had a really hard time welcoming, graffiti, street art. There was a real resistance to it, millions of reasons, and so it wasn't very clear, other than the popularity of the genre, right? Because that was definitely a selling tool with some institutions, to bring the artists in, but and so it that has happened, right? We have moved into museums, and Callie, you told me your story about when you were inducted to MoMA. Can you share that with us? Because I think it's very illustrative of that. Like what?
Yeah. So I was waitressing and I didn't have a gallery yet. I was just doing stuff out on the street, and I got an email from MoMA and they were like, "Can you come by?" And I was like, "What?" And they were like, "Yeah, bring some work." And I'm like, just
Bring
like,
some work.
Yeah, bring some art. And I was like, "Okay." And I'm just like a scrappy kid in New York. I just like put like an enormous backpack with just all my pieces just flying out
Is
the
this
back.
that military rucksack you used to run
It was
around with?
like it. It was like just literally just open, flying out the back. And I biked from like Brooklyn to MoMA, which is like an hour. And I arrived like, I'm like a sweaty. And I run into my friend who's like a security guard, and he was like, "Hey, do you want me to get you in?" And I was like, "Yeah, this is really weird, but I have a meeting." And so I just go in. And I lay all my stuff out on the table, and they bought work like just out of my backpack. It was like a special time.
You might be the only artist that ever bought work out of a backpack. I'm just saying.
It's a dangerous story to tell because you're going to inspire people to show up to MoMA with like a backpack.
Did they pay cash too? Or?
Yeah, in the alley. It was amazing.
And RJ, you've played a big role in kind of educating the public and advocating for the genre. How have you seen this? You were like very young. How old were you when you saw OSGEMEOS on the
when
tape?
that Tate show happened? And I think the important thing to note about that show is it was not indoors. It was all exterior. Yeah. They did not have an indoor component. There was, a film screening here or there. I think Public Discourse, which Kelly is in, maybe screened. But other than that, it was all exterior. And I remember at the time being like very frustrated. And I had that same experience of, I don't think till I was in my mid-20s, I was also not that comfortable in museums. And so this is weird. But I remember being frustrated that it wasn't also indoors because it felt like we hadn't been invited inside yet, right? And it was, I don't think it was sponsored by Nissan or Hyundai or something. It's like, okay, so if a car company wants to come by, we'll put something on the exterior because you wrote us a big check, but we don't actually care about this work, right? And then that show got so much attention, they kind of had to be like, oh, I guess we care about this. And so it has changed, right?
Yeah.
For sure. It's been a big change as things have come in. And I think mostly for the better, but I think, Callie, you're right that there is also, there's people whose art practices are businesses now for good and for bad, right? And yeah.
It's funny because when I heard that the Tate was doing something, I think it was OSGEMEOS who told me. And I said, okay, well, I got to go. And I emailed one of the curators. And I was like, hey, you're doing this street art show. I'd like to come. I was, trying to invite myself to the opening. And the response was, what are you talking about? We're not doing a street art show. And I was like, well, no, they're painting the outside of the building. They're like, what are you talking about? And so it was Nissan Bikes actually had set up a huge ramp outside, and they brought these artists. Now, however the humble beginning to this was, you're right, it was a huge success. And it did open the doors because several years later, when I was working on another show, the same curator was like, "Oh my God, Pedro, do you remember when we did that show at the Tate?" And I was like, "I remember you didn't know anything about it." But you know, so it's an interesting dynamic to see how watching the art world embrace this genre, right? And it's, you know, it's, so I will say I feel very lucky because I was doing a lot of shows when no one was interested. So I was able to do a bunch of shows just because there was no competition, which was actually pretty cool.
And you know, we have the Banksy exhibition also downstairs with Basquiat, and I'll say Banksy, I think, understands this very well and has played his cards really wisely here, where when he does a show, it's in Bristol, it's in Glasgow, it's in the seaside town, right? It's not in London. When it was in London, it was a public show, it wasn't in a museum. But when he goes to a museum and can charge a ticket price, he's doing it in these places where he's actually bringing tourists to the local economy and pumping millions of dollars or pounds into the economy. And I think that's intentional. I mean, you think he couldn't get a show at a museum in London? Of course he could. But he's more interested in these, you know, quote unquote second cities. And that was explicit when he had Dismaland, but I think it runs through a lot of what he does. I mean, having a hotel in the West Bank. Not, if you're just trying to make money, not the smartest move. If you're trying to drive unique tourism to a place that might not be on the top of somebody's list, very smart move.
Yeah. Thank you, RJ. Alfonso, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I started going to museums when it was a little more, I mean, I've always gone to museums, but at least understanding the art world a little more once it was accepted. But I do remember the Art in the Streets exhibition at MoCA. I didn't realize it was a big controversy. I remember going with my friends. I remember going, yeah, like all the LA graffiti writer dudes, kids, whatever, were going, and we loved it, and that was really special, and I still think about that. But now when I go back and I read about what happened, or I hear, or I talk to people who were there, and the art world didn't accept it.
Like Jeffrey got fired.
Jeffrey got fired because of that. So, yeah.
It's been a long journey, but also very, very fruitful. I think so there've been, you know, for me, what's changed the most is you know, the notion of ephemeral, the notion of time, and spontaneity, right? You know, artists like Callie and, you know, Shepard Fairey, you know, kind of walking around a city, stalking to find a good spot to put up a piece, and having to do it immediately, and developing techniques to not get arrested, you know, because it had to be quick. And then so Callie, how has that time changed for you now, where you know, I mean, now people ask you to put up murals. Before, you just sort of did it without permission.
I mean, now I'm in street art retirement. You did bring me out for a second in Lisbon last year, but I'm in street art retirement, largely just because I had to continue to evolve creatively, and it's such a dominating obsession that I was like, I cannot evolve if I'm going to keep, like, it just takes everything. So, but I loved the ephemerality, and I loved that you mentioned Cy Twombly, because there's this Twombly quote where he talks about the graffiti on the streets of Paris, where these little stone carvings like kids would do into the walls. And he was saying how like it struck you with the force of an event, and just that like feeling of like a thing has happened. And like, you know, one of my early influences was Gordon Matta Clark, was like, you know, cutting up buildings that were about to be destroyed, like the sense that there's an inherent ephemerality to it. And like my choice to work with paper was a choice. Like I did a couple spray stencils, and I was like, oh, I want that rotting and that decay and that change, you know? But then eventually I did find, you know, that I also wanted a piece of the puzzle that was more permanent. And, you know, so what I because it took me a while. You know what's weird is I said no to that Tate show. I almost don't even remember why. I was like busy, but I don't actually, I still was really uncomfortable with those projects early on. And trying to sort of figure out where I fit with it. But
Just
now,
imagine the paper floating off of the Tate from, 70 feet in the air as it decayed. Beautiful.
would have been lovely. But yeah, it's now I kind of understand there's like a tandem aspect for me where I'm like, museums like hold the permanent piece. They do the educational work. They contextualize. They do all these things. And the artwork out in the wild that's the artwork out in the wild, in all different ways, whether it's a raft on the river or paper on the wall or whatever it is.
I will tease you for the rest of your life, Callie, that the first time I asked her to be in a show, she said, I can't because I don't want this to sound weird, but I'm building boats and floating down the Mississippi with friends. And you might have seen some images of her boats. So Alfonso, this genre obviously has influenced you. There's some images of Alfonso's work with tags, graffiti, the urban landscape. But you've also begun to do public work, like start to work outside. You started making paintings, for kind of interior space, and now you're working on outdoor. Is your outdoor work in any way related to kind of what graffiti or street art or that kind of relatable aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, well, I have a background in commercial sign painting. My father's a sign painter, and I didn't go to art school. I learned how to paint at work. So first I was doing lettering and storefronts and things. Then I began working with companies that paint large outdoor advertisements, so hand-painted billboards. And that's where I learned how to paint. So, and before that, painting graffiti. So painting outdoors and has always, I've just always done it. I think the art practice, like the indoor studio practice, I've always had it, but it wasn't as consistent. Was working at home and things, and but as far as it being, I think there is, I think that it's all, there's like I'm inspired by all of it, but I wouldn't say that I'm thinking about graffiti in that way. I still do graffiti, and graffiti's like, there's so many. So there's like, painting like a.
Is it like working out, like or like meditation?
Okay, so there is like painting, spending hours painting a colorful piece, a stylized piece. I used to do that a lot. Now I don't really do that because it takes a lot of time, and I feel like I get my fix in the studio, like my, being creative and figuring out style and things. But you could always do like a tag. So you carry something and pop off a quick tag that takes like a few seconds, and that or like
with a marker,
everything,
spray paint, whatever you got,
all of it.
Yeah.
So, and that is a lot of my friends are graffiti writers, so it's I'm still in that environment, I'm still in that world, but I don't really spend the time painting the pieces like I used to. Although I did one last weekend, but I feel like it all informs everything, and there's a lot of contemporary artists or people who work in the art world who either come from the background or still participate, but they sort of, it's like a secret. I think it's cool that it's a secret.
Yeah, absolutely.
Typically I wouldn't talk about it, but now I don't shy away from it because my work incorporates, it's about that, and I feel like if I was making the type of work that I do and didn't participate in this, it would almost be like,
anthropological.
Yeah, like my work incorporates sign painting. I'm a second generation sign painter. My work incorporates graffiti, the street, my neighborhood, and it's not like I'm an outsider. I'm participating in it. This is like my world. So, yeah.
Thank you. No, that's really good and very informative because I think that it in many ways you are highlighting how OSGEMEOS feels about graffiti or Barry McGee feels about graffiti, which is it's like something else. right? It's like, you know, there's their artwork and then there's graffiti. And I kind of like the fact that graffiti is still wild and transgressive and, you know, hard to define exactly. We have 6 more minutes. We can open it up to questions. Any other comments? Thank you all for being here. Any comments?
I'm just wondering, just from other writers hearing similar things, and maybe you've both touched on this, but you know, when you're just carrying around a spray can or a marker, for the most part at this point, is there a little bit of like, you know, my tag used to be here, or my name should still be in front of my coffee shop, right? Like, you're not trying to be the most up artist in the city, writer in the city anymore, but there's a little bit of like what do you think keeps you exercising that muscle?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of things. I mean, it's an addiction, but it's also, I love the act of it. I think it's, you know, to share, for my friends to see it, to share images, like photos of things that I've done. And I feel like if I don't have like a marker or something, sometimes I have the opportunity to like get a tag and I don't have anything on me and I feel like, fuck, like
The addiction.
yeah, missing out on. So I think it's a lot of things, but yeah, basically.
So should I start saying I'm in street art recovery rather than in street art retirement?
So do you still run out and do stuff every once?
Almost never.
Almost never. Yeah.
Because it feels like that. It feels like you have to be like, no. It's like
Oh, so you're like cold turkey.
you really have to cold
Yeah.
turkey because you'll backslide, and it just takes everything. It takes over.
That's yes, 100%. And it's like once you start, you just got to keep going, and it's like it's a slippery slope.
Yeah. No, I've seen you. When we did that show in Oaxaca. I remember you had there were some young people who wanted to help you, and you had them with the buckets sloshing around, and you were like, all right, we're going, and that look of determination and excitement in your face. I don't see that very often. That's a very specific look.
Lock in.
Yeah, and you're like, all right, we're going, and then I walked around the city, and your work was everywhere. So yeah. Any questions? Thank you. Any questions?
I have strong feelings on this. So I think at an international level, what you're saying is totally right. Like, OSGEMEOS is receiving the occasional hip hop album, and they were b-boys and dancing, and I think their tracksuit is in this exhibition, right? So yes, totally. In a New York level, the early writers, because they have schooled me on this. Like, I love Charlie Ahern, Wild Style director, but there are guys who are like, hate Charlie Ahern. Sorry, I've been cursing tonight. And it's a fancy place to do that. I shouldn't. But they're like, I freaking hate him because, you know, I listen to Led Zeppelin.
Yeah,
and
that's
right. And people think that just because I wrote graffiti on the trains in the 70s and 80s that I must have been down at the Mud Club, you know, dancing to hip hop with Fab Five Freddy every weekend. And so I think in New York it was much more complex. Yeah. But Shepard will talk about, and you can talk about the sort of the skate culture and how that brought Shepard internationally. So music was a part of that, his story for sure.
Yeah. I think Futura and Lee Quinones would talk. I've heard them say it too, where they're like, no one listened to hip hop then. It was like this nascent thing. But it was packaged together, hip hop, breakdancing, and what I think is really interesting about the 3 graffiti as well is that they're all learned on the street, right? You weren't going to go to Juilliard to learn how to break dance, right? And you couldn't, right? So this idea that it was learned on the street, that the barrier to entry was very low, I think is really important. And I think that when we talk and think about a global influence, and OSGEMEOS are a perfect example of receiving this influence on the other side of the world and being able to partake, it was precisely because the barrier to entry was so low, and it allowed for this explosion of expression, which we see all over the world. And I think that that is one of the most important things about this genre, right? The impact it had. And Shepard, Shepard grew up in Charleston. Very conservative parents. His father was the captain of the football team. His mother was the head cheerleader. Went to church all the time. I mean, very conservative. And for him, music was a way of escaping, this Southern living, and that culture, and being part of a bigger part of the world. And Shepard is innately rebellious, and just took to that. But he tells me stories that before he started skateboarding, he would play tennis every day. So don't tell him I said that. But so it was an interesting development. The music played a big role because the music was part of the aesthetic, the T-shirts, and it was also became an outlet. And although he will tell you that it was a very poor livelihood, right? He'd make a lot of money making T-shirts and posters and prints. It helped him get started, and he took that culture and was able to, succeed tremendously. So do we have time for one more question? Oh.
Yeah, I feel like, as far as competition, I feel like rather than thinking about it as competition, I feel like I have peers that maybe come from similar backgrounds and are also in the art world. So it's more like a crew, but not like an official like collective, or there's no name or anything. It's just like friends. And sometimes I go to events or dinners, and it could be boring, but if I see my friends, I'm like, oh, cool, like the homies are here. And then and then also it's like, work, like supporting friends, going to their shows, these types of things are really important. So rather than me being like blocking things or being jealous, I think like I love to see my friends succeed and their success, and it's like everybody has their time and their moment, for people who work hard and stuff. So it's like, I'm also part of graffiti crews, but I feel like it's sort of like when I see, like say if I see a friend's piece, like a graffiti piece on the street, I get happy. I'm like, I didn't do it, but I kind of feel like I'm connected to it. Like that looks good on me, although it's not me, but that's like my homie. So like, yeah, something like that.
You know what I was also just thinking is, because there are a few artists, and I do think OSGEMEOS are one of them, where like maybe there's like a feeling throughout your lives that you're like, you are a little bit trying to like poke each other or like one up each other. And then I was like, that's how you know who your peers are.
Yeah.
Because if you don't feel a little competitive with somebody, that's not your peer. They're not inspiring you to be like, wait a minute, like I have to do this better because and like I'm like, oh, but that's the fun part, right? That's when you're like, oh, you're inspiring me to do better, and that means you really are my peer.
Yeah, no, I get it from, I'll do something with an artist and then I'll hear from another artist like, wow, you guys, like, that was really good. And there is like a little competitiveness, maybe a little jealousy, I guess.
Sibling rivalry.
But I have found this genre, this particularly street art. I can't speak so much about graffiti, but and well, too, actually, your community in LA is super supportive, right? Like what's going on in LA right now is insane, and I'm, I spend a lot of time there because it's very exciting what you and your peers are doing. You just came from a show in Chicago with a bunch of your friends, Lauren Halsey and Mario Yala. I mean, it's very impressive what's going on in LA right now. But with street art, even though some of the artists are like, we're not street artists. I'm like, well, you're all friends. You all know each other, you hang out together, you share information, you support each other. So whether you want to call yourself street art or not, you are part of a group. And this is a group that wasn't created by curators. It's a group that you guys self-selected big time and have been hanging out together forever. So
Actually, do you remember? So we did that show in San Diego, and there was these two pieces.
the cute surfer.
No, the JR piece. Although you do find great assistance. No, there was the JR piece next to my piece, and you came to me a little nervous, and you were like, "Hey, like I gotta ask you a thing." So, like, you know, the artist JR. I was, of course. He was like, "Well, JR wants to," and I felt like you kind of sat down like it was going to be a big conversation, and you were like, "And he wants to run his whole thing under your whole thing," and I was like, "Cool," and you go, "Cool." I was like, yeah, that's the whole conversation.
I was
We're
so
done.
nervous.
And you were
Yeah.
so relieved. You were like, oh my God, I've been working with artists for 20 years. And no, that conversation would not have gone that way.
Yeah. No, and it's true. Thank you for bringing that up. I put that away in a deep dark corner of my psyche, but I think that it is a very, in my experience, it has been a very generous group of artists who have really supported each other. And also, I mean, I have to say, as a curator, it's awesome to work with artists that support each other, whether it's, you know, your cohort or your cohort. I love it. I mean, I'm seeing you guys in LA all the time. You know, we've been spending decades together. So I think that it is, the rivalry is there, the sibling rivalry, the competitive nature. But I also think it's true because it does make it good. And when artists learn from each other, it only makes it better.
I want to, but kind of even going back to your question about the music and what it has to do with this conversation as well. It's like I grew up playing in punk bands or going to hip hop shows, underground hip hop shows, and these sorts of things are just like we just used to do it. So it was like a backyard or wherever, right? Like you make you get a band, you get whatever, like a turntables or make a flyer, and you have something, right? So when I first sort of started making art, I mean, I've always made art, but more recently, I sort of just carried that DIY energy into what I'm doing. So no one approached me to be in their exhibition. I made an exhibition with friends, invited friends at an artist run space, basically a studio space with like a hallway, and made a flyer, invited people, artists show up, artists invite me to something, and then, you know, little by little I'm in group shows. But it wasn't a curator, it wasn't a collector, it wasn't the art world, it was my peers. And that energy is like the punk thing, it's like the hip hop thing, it's like and I feel like a lot of people, I mean, I didn't even know, I didn't know what the hell I was doing, you know? But I knew I was making things and I wanted to get together with friends, and I saw what friends were doing. So I didn't wait for someone to invite me or for someone to give me an opportunity. I made that. And I feel like graffiti also taught me that, you know. I used to steal spray paint. I couldn't even buy spray paint. You know, you have to be 18 to get spray. I used to steal spray paint, go out, I see a spot, go paint the spot. I didn't ask for permission, I did it, and I feel like I still carry that energy. And it's that DIY thing, and it's, you know, and now it's like, okay, I show in museums and galleries, like all this stuff, but that wouldn't have happened if I was waiting for it, you know?
Yeah, thank you. That's very important. And I think it carries through in you know, this kind of DIY practice is wonderful. Well, I think we're out of time, but thank you all for coming, and thank you for your, you know, wonderful panel.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much.